Sputnik was a 23-inch silver ball with whiskers that was launched by the Soviet Union in 1957. And it created an immediate reaction among Americans because the thought was not only had America been beaten into space by its biggest post-World War II competitor, but it also alerted America to the possibility that the Soviet Union was now in a position to drop bombs from space if need be, and America became alarmed. The educational response was the National Defense Education Act, passed in 1958, and that act concentrated on higher academic standards for the schools. Around that same time, economists began talking about the role of education and how economics were impacted by education. In 1955, Milton Friedman wrote his seminal Role of Government in Education, where he introduced the idea of education as an economic investment. It's a rational choice. It's something that a family might choose to do. And it's made as part of a free market kind of environment, according to Friedman. So what you do as a student is you consider your possibilities in the world. Would I like to face my future with a high school diploma, or do I think I need more than that? So every student has to weigh the cost of that education against the potential long-term benefits. And so that was the idea of this rational choice that students make. I made the choice, you've made the choice, and we do it based on a certain amount of information. Friedman was also in favor of vocational training, and he was in favor of vouchers, a very controversial and even many people believe unconstitutional idea in American governance. But the idea of a voucher would be where whatever money the state was going to contribute to your education might be portable. It might be something that a person could use. You don't get the actual cash, but you could say, well, I want to take the money the state was going to pay for my education, and I want to take it to a different school. I want to take it to a private school. I want to take it to a religious school. And that's where the rub comes in for the Constitution. Friedman also importantly said that school adds economic value to the student. And this idea was reinforced in 1961 when Theo Schultz introduced the formal theory of human capital. And he starts talking about things like rates of return on investment. So, for example, to become a doctor requires many years of training. It is a very expensive kind of proposition, but afterwards, doctors command a pretty hefty salary, and therefore their ability to pay that back and their long-term rate of return is seen to be very great. Fields that don't yield as much in terms of long-term salary, generally speaking, cost less to go through. Maybe they're 4-year programs, that kind of thing. So what comes out of this is the notion that people are worth the investment, and therefore our schools are worth the investment. Well, in 1966, there was a report done by James Coleman from Johns Hopkins University called Inequality of Educational Opportunity. And this report was required by the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But shockingly, instead of finding out what those factors were that made a good school, what Coleman learned was that family background factors had a greater bearing on school performance than did any of the in-school variables. In other words, all those things that were true of a student's home and family and access to food and security and parents that were literate and who would take kids places, that background information that people came to school with was seen as being very important. This was a huge study, 650,000 students. Now, among the in-school factors that Coleman found that had the greatest bearing on student achievement was the quality of the teacher. That was the number one thing that he found, and it's the number one thing that seems to hold true throughout all of educational history, really. Among the family background factors, he found that the one that most readily identified with a student being successful in school was the educational background of the mother. He also found that African American students benefited from schooling in non-segregated schools, and this idea was used to launch the idea of busing, which was very controversial in our history and remains so today. Well, education in the late 60s and 70s was fairly loose, and even you might think was an effort to combat or to oppose authority. The 60s were a time of freedom of expression, and you had a lot of educational programs that showed up on the scene where they wanted to tear down the walls and let students design their own courses and take classes that they were interested in rather than learning from the classic texts of the old white dead men or old dead white men, I guess I should say, who dominated most of our classic literature. Summerhill in England was a school that went so far as to say that adult authority was strictly forbidden. Well, the 60s and 70s ultimately came to a close, and one of the things that helped them get there was a New York Times report in 1975 that showed that SAT scores across the nation were falling. There were some other influential reports that added on to this. In 1983, the report that probably had the greatest impact on American education, arguably even greater than the Coleman report, was called A Nation at Risk. This was during the Reagan administration, and his blue ribbon panel of national experts, many of whom were from business and not from education, said that when we compare American curriculum to that of other advanced countries, we have a need to raise our standards. Of course, what the other countries in the world were doing was trying to catch up and surpass the United States, which had built the greatest world economy on having a high percentage of educated citizens in the country. So A Nation at Risk called for higher college admission standards. Now, in 1985, there was a Kentucky report called The Path to a Larger Life, which came from the Pritchard Committee. The Pritchard Committee was named for Ed Pritchard, who was a public intellectual and a Democratic strategist on the national scene. He was Frankfurter's law clerk in the U.S. Supreme Court and was very highly thought of. And later in life, after spending some time in prison for some election law violations where they were stuffing ballot boxes in Bourbon County, as I recall, he sort of reformed his life by becoming active in education policy in Kentucky. And Pritchard's idea was to envision a seamless web of education that ran essentially from birth or from preschool, the earliest educational years, all the way through the highest levels of educational attainment that one could have. So he wanted to connect all these pieces that previously had been pretty well not connected. Elementary schools did what they did. Middle schools did what they did. High schools did what they did. They were connected in a sense, but fairly loosely. And what we ultimately find out is that having a high school diploma was not connected, at least not well enough, to what one needed to be successful in college. Well, there were some court cases that dealt with school funding that kind of impact this issue as well. These cases initially were made on 14th Amendment grounds and essentially said that, well, in the first case that came out of Illinois, McGinnis versus Shapiro, the courts basically said, yes, we can see in the Illinois school system you've got rich schools and you've got poor schools. And we don't think that that's equal, but we don't have any standards that make it possible for us to say whether or not a state has done what they should do for the students. And so the courts right off the bat kind of said that handling cases related to school funding and equity in the schools was going to be a difficult proposition. Well, a few years later, there was a Serrano versus Priest case in California, where their financial system, for the first time in history, a state's finance system, was determined to be unconstitutional. But only 2 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court had another case out of Texas called San Antonio versus Rodriguez, where it essentially ruled that 14th Amendment claims can't be brought when it comes to education, because after all, education is a province of the states, not of the country, and therefore there were no protections. That if a person had a problem with how education was being run, they had to get that resolved in state court, not federal court. Well, by the time states started looking at how to approach equity in the schools at the state level, Kentucky had a case called Rose versus Council for Better Education, where former Governor Burt Combs represented a bunch of superintendents from poor districts around the state and basically argued that our school system, our financing system, was unconstitutional, not only because it was unequal, but also because it was inadequate. And this was a shocking case that led to CARA in 1990. But there was another important element that came out of this case, and that was where the Kentucky Supreme Court accepted the idea that standards would be a way that a court could determine whether or not the state had done what it should do for its educational system. So at this time, the standards-based school reform movement is born. And at the same time as the Rose case, on the national scene, President George H.W. Bush had gotten together an education summit. He brought together all of the governors in America, and he brought in Al Shanker, who was the president of the American Federation of Teachers and a very prominent, well thought of educational policymaker at the time. And he urged the governors to establish a national system of high standards and rigorous assessments with real consequences. And this formed the basis for the school reform movement that you will become a part of and that exists today. President Bush also named a bright young governor out of Arkansas to sort of head up this program. And of course, this guy ended up being President Bill Clinton, who defeated Bush a couple of years later and initiated what he calls a Goals 2000 program. Now, initially, President Clinton wanted to, he basically wanted to have a set of national standards. And what he did was he started with U.S. history, and he pulled together a bunch of people to begin creating these standards when Lynn Cheney, who at the time was running the National Humanities Council, sort of rebelled publicly against this. And she brought a lot of political clout to the argument, and President Clinton backed off. So instead of just having a national set of standards, his Goals 2000 program provided funds to states so that they could develop their own standards and assessments. And so we kind of got away from the idea of national assessment pretty well at the beginning. Well, then No Child Left Behind came along in 2002, actually passed in 2001, took effect in 2002, and it embraced this standards-based reform movement. The Bush administration, now this is George W. Bush, required states to test every child annually in grades 3 through 8 in reading and math. And he did something else that was extremely important, and that was they caused schools to report what's known as disaggregated test score data. What's important about this, it's a very powerful kind of a new development on the scene. Initially, when I was a young principal in the 80s, We reported test scores, but it was always internal. We would get our tests back, the district would look at them, the school board would look at them. We truly and honestly wanted our students to do well, and we tried to develop the best programs we could. But if the school's students didn't perform very well, it wasn't really thought of as being the school's fault. Based on the impact of the Coleman report, most educators believe that, well, the student came from a bad family. They didn't have what they needed to do well in school. And indeed, today it's well recognized that the powerful effects of poverty have great impact on student achievement in the schools. I know from my own experience, I would have a student who came from very modest circumstances, and I remember one in particular who went into a class of mine, and he sat down next to another second grader who read Scientific American for fun. And these two kids were supposed to come out of second grade both having met standards that were appropriate for that grade level. So we started seeing in there large achievement gaps, which became a concern really for the first time. The power of disaggregating student test score data is that you can no longer hide large groups of students who were not performing well in school. Used to be we could. The scores that got reported were school-wide averages. So if you had 20 or 30% of your students that weren't doing very well, but the rest of your students were doing great, they could kind of cover up for those that weren't doing well. But when you get down to disaggregating data, what happens is schools begin looking at the different subgroups of students within that student population. How do the boys do? How do the girls do? How do blacks do? How do whites do? How do our special ed kids do? How do they compare to the gifted children? The idea that every student would reach the same high standard was really put to the test when it came to disaggregating data. And the object behind it was to be able to more carefully examine the achievement gaps that exist between groups of students. Well, No Child Left Behind went along for a while, but it had a major flaw in it. And I shouldn't say it went on for a while. It still exists today. Today, the Congress is debating whether or not to reauthorize the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which is the very same law. Just when President Bush put it in 2002, he renamed it No Child Left Behind. So now the Congress is debating whether or not to change that law. Well, one of the problems with No Child Left Behind was that the law allowed each state to select the tests and the proficiency standards by which it determined whether or not that state had met its federal goals for what they called adequate yearly progress. And if you allow each state to develop their own tests and develop their own standards, then you can't compare the test data. And this was a big problem. I think Louisiana, for example, in 2005 or so, it was reported that Louisiana was basically saying it had the second highest proficient fourth grade readers in America, based on their state test and their state standards. The problem was their test was easy, their standards were low, and that's why they looked like they were one of the strongest in the nation. But when you took a look at Louisiana's test scores through the NAEP exam, which is a National Assessment of Educational Progress and is only taken by a random selection of students throughout the country. It is a scientific study. We do get very reliable data from it. So when we looked at how Louisiana's fourth grade readers performed on the NAEP, they were the second lowest in the country. So under No Child Left Behind, they looked like they were way high, but when you really looked at their actual reading performance, they were at the very bottom. Clearly, this idea of having each state create their own standards and tests was really going to be difficult. Well, the power of disaggregating student test score data actually created a shift in philosophy. When I was a teacher, the philosophy was equality of educational opportunity. And that's what the schools were supposed to provide, an equal educational opportunity. Now, what that meant was I get to go to a decent school. and I get to have a teacher who's qualified. But if I don't do my homework, if I disrupt class, if I don't do those things that a good student should do, if I misbehave, if I bother others, whatever it is, if I don't reach standards, if I don't make good grades in school, if I don't pass my courses, well, it's my fault. I didn't do the thing that I should have done as a student. Once the nation began examining achievement gaps under disaggregated data, the philosophy actually changed. And today's teachers work under a philosophy that's better expressed as as equity of student achievement outcomes. Not that every student's going to get the same score on tests and they're all going to perform in an identical lockstep kind of fashion. It's not that, but that when we take a look at how boys perform and how girls perform, the idea is that there should be some equity there. You shouldn't have one group that appears to get a great education and another group that does not. And when we take a look at racial achievement gaps, that's exactly what we were seeing. We were seeing white students on average outperforming black students on standardized tests by as much as 15 points. Over time, both white students and black student test scores have been improving in America. But even though that has occurred, there have been many times when white students, while both groups grew, white students would continue to grow more, particularly those from higher economic levels that had a lot of advantages. I know in my own schools, one of our frustrations was every time we tried to put in a new program that would help African American students, it would help them, but it tended to help white students even more. So it was a pretty frustrating and difficult kind of a prospect to have schools and teachers overcome the negative impact of poverty that many of our students face. Well, there were a lot of school reform groups that got into the act around the time of No Child Left Behind. There was a new group that was formed by the National Governors Association called Achieve. They worked with the Thomas Fordham Foundation, which is kind of a libertarian group, business-oriented though, a little bit more moderate than some of the libertarian groups. The Education Trust, which was focused on combating poverty in American society, and the Baldrige Foundation through their National Alliance of Business, which was very much a business group. And what happened was this standards-based school reform began to take on the tenor of business. Higher standards, making decisions based on data. This was a very business-oriented kind of reform, and indeed historians are calling it corporate education reform. So if you hear standards-based reform or you hear the term corporate education reform, they're really talking about essentially the same thing. And there were some common elements to this reform movement. The first element was Common Core state standards. The argument was we need to have everybody on the same page. If you take Algebra 1 in New Mexico and you pass the course, it ought to mean pretty much the same thing as passing Algebra 1 in Estill County. And the way you make it mean the same thing is you have this common core of standards that describe the learning that students have to achieve. They also wanted to enhance graduation requirements, and they initiated high-stakes assessments. I described for you a little bit ago about how when we would do testing back in the 80s, our school district would see the reports, but really nobody else did. Well, since CARA, when a school test data is graded, usually in the fall. You take the test in the spring, test data comes out in the fall. It comes out in the newspaper. It's published. And then the newspapers took that data and they started ranking schools. And this had a very large impact on how people viewed the schools. The high stakes part of that accountability system meant that if you were in a school that wasn't performing very well, you could well be fired for that. And they'll just bring in another teacher that they think is going to do a better job working with the students. Then the last thing that was going on was that these corporate education reformers wanted what they called P12 data systems. That means they wanted the ability to track the performance of individual students from the time they entered preschool until they graduated high school. What we're seeing today are college level data systems that will pick up students as they come out of college and continue to track them throughout. So we're seeing that notion expanded. Governor Fletcher embraced this corporate education reform in Kentucky. You may recall Governor Fletcher served until 2007. He favored a couple of other elements of corporate ed reform that didn't really manifest themselves much in Kentucky. He fought against tenure, teachers' unions. He thought kind of agreed with the idea that if we could just identify our worst 5% of our teachers and get rid of them, that we'd improve our schools overall. He liked the idea of pay for performance. He liked the idea of school choice, like charter schools, and mayors controlling schools, as we've seen in Chicago and Detroit and in a few of the cities in the U.S. But these elements did not become part of reform in Kentucky. Kentucky went a different way. Well, there was a catalytic event that occurred in 2007 with the release of the National Center for Education Statistics report. And this is where they basically came up with that information I shared with you about Louisiana. That Louisiana, basically the point was that we could not compare student achievement from state to state. That we had some states that had lowered their standards to such a degree that they appeared to be doing well when really they weren't. Well, No Child Left Behind was depending on a standards-based movement. And once the research showed that that was unreliable data and they really couldn't compare states, this created a problem. A couple of guys who were very much involved in this corporate education movement were fellows named David Coleman and Gene Wilhoit. Coleman had worked with a national foundation that was promoting education. Gene Wilhoit had been Kentucky's Commissioner of Education. And at the time, Wilhoit was serving as executive director of the Council of Chief State School Officers. This is a group of people who were statewide superintendents or education commissioners, and they worked directly under the National Governors Association. Well, what Coleman and Wilhoit did is they came up with this idea to approach philanthropist Bill Gates. And they convinced him to spend more than $2 million advancing a set of core curriculum standards that would be common to all states. And over the next couple of years, and you think about how quickly this occurred, they talked to Gates in the summer of 2008, and by June of 2009, 45 states plus the District of Columbia had responded to the $200 million campaign that the Gates Foundation advanced, and they adopted the Common Core curriculum. So that is a huge jump in a short amount of time. If you ever wonder what $200 million looks like, you won't be able to see this very well, but I was playing around with Gates Foundation grants in the year 2010. We're much further down the road than this today. If I were to recreate this diagram today, it would be larger and would have even more tentacles. But essentially what I was doing was taking a look at the Gates Foundation and a couple of the other foundations that impacted education in America, and I just wanted to see where the money was going. And it was and try to gain a sense of how this campaign manifested itself. And the Gates Foundation was funding everybody. Groups on the right, groups on the left, it didn't matter. If you were in favor of Common Core, you were very likely to get $1 million from the Gates Foundation to do your work. So what resulted in that were a bunch of these policy advocacy groups and think tanks and foundations all across the nation that were beating the drums for Common Core standards. And as I mentioned, 45 states jumped on board initially. So by the time we get to 2009, nearly all of the education policy momentum was on one side. It was business plus foundations plus government, and they were all pushing for this corporate education reform movement. In July of 2009, the nature of Common Core changed, and it changed due to an action of the president. The Obama administration decided that it was going to award grants to various states who were doing some of this corporate ed reform work. And he called that grant program Race to the Top. But in order to be eligible to receive part of this, I think it was $4.35 billion. So states got, some states like Tennessee got a couple $100 million just for one state. That's a big number. But in order to share in that money, a state had to agree that they were going to adopt, essentially, they were going to adopt Common Core. What they called it was internationally benchmarked standards and assessments to prepare kids for success in college and the workplace, but what they were talking about was Common Core. Well, in Kentucky, a new bill was passed called Senate Bill 1, which also required a new state curriculum, and it required a new test. And what do you know? Common Core just happened to match what Senate Bill 1 was calling for. Kentucky had just hired a brand new commissioner named Terry Holliday, and he came in and in his very first speech to the legislature told how happy he was to commit to Senate Bill 1 and Race to the Top, and said, if you want to see where Kentucky's headed, just read our Race to the Top application with the U.S. Office of Ed, and that'll tell you where we're going. And it was a fairly comprehensive embrace of these corporate education reforms. It did not get into those areas that I mentioned when we were talking about Governor Fletcher. So charter schools didn't make it. We still have teacher tenure in Kentucky. We still have teachers unions in Kentucky. There have been some people arguing against them, but there was no full-on attack the way we had seen in some other states. So Kentucky adopted the Common Core on February the 11th, 2010. This was actually before the Common Core state standards were completed, but they did know pretty much what was in them, and they went to work immediately. So unlike other states that were taking their time, Kentucky jumped in with both feet, and by the spring of 2012, began assessing students based on those Common Core standards. The first state in the nation to do so. Well, as we mentioned, President Obama included the Common Core state standards in his Race to the Top program, and once he did that, the issue of Common Core became politicized. That's just something that goes along with being president, as I understand it. Presidents have a big bully pulpit, and the minute they shine a light on something, people immediately start focusing on it. And that's what happened with the Republican National Committee. And they came out in April of 2013 with basically a platform statement that said that the Republican National Committee would no longer support Common Core. And there was some more opposition to Common Core that formed both on the left and on the right. Support for Common Core actually is in the moderate. It's in the middle of the political spectrum. But on the left, you've got a lot of people that don't like the corporate education reform movement and the high stakes assessment. And they think much of that is a misuse of statistics, that we're really not able to identify good teachers and bad teachers the way we tell the public we can, and that a lot of these systems that we use are unfair. On the right, you've got people, mostly in the libertarian camp, who oppose Common Core because they think it's federal overreach, where the Obama administration, which technically is precluded by law from getting involved in curriculum, they complain that the Obama administration should not have included Common Core state standards as part of their federal Race to the Top program. And so you've got opposition on both ends, but support for Common Core remains pretty solid in the middle. We still have 43 states that are involved in Common Core. Well, as an early adopter, Kentucky kind of made a name for itself. It, in a sense, followed up on CARA from 1990. That really was the first time Kentucky became known nationally as an education reform state. As I mentioned, we were the first state where the Supreme Court had declared the entire system of schooling to be unconstitutional. And this was a landmark occurrence. I can remember in the early 1990s, whenever I would go to a national conference, I'd invariably be approached by somebody from another state that would say, "How in the heck did you guys get school reform passed the way you did in Kentucky?" And Kentucky became known as a reform state. And in my opinion, when Senate Bill 1 came out in 2009, a lot of the educational leaders in the state wanted to maintain that position. And so it was a bit of a press effort, kind of a way to keep a relatively poor state on the national radar screen when it came to education reform. So Kentucky was an early adopter of Common Core, and they embraced it with both arms. Not only did we begin testing students under the new standards in 2012, but we also created learning networks where the Gates Foundation gave Kentucky $1 million to establish teams throughout the state that would begin to communicate with teachers about how to teach Common Core. This has been a weakness in many other states. A lot of the states where Common Core is under attack are under attack because they haven't adequately prepared their teachers. So Kentucky kind of has its unique history as an education reform state in the 21st century. We had one case in Kentucky where a Tea Party activist out of Nicholasville filed suit against Common Core. I actually studied this case in some detail. This suit was laughed out of court, essentially. He got a summary judgment after one hearing. It was a poorly conceived case, and it had nothing to do with slowing down any progress with Common Core in Kentucky. So we've got broad support for Common Core, but we also have this set of standards that are mired in controversy. So the question has to be asked, whose standards are these? Are these really voluntary national standards, the way they started out? Or are these federally imposed standards because of Race to the Top? Is there federal overreach involved? I think there's a pretty good argument that there is. This was not a new idea. As a matter of fact, Lyndon Baines Johnson, back in 1964 through 68, working with Martin Luther King Jr., first began the idea that the federal government would withhold money from any state that failed to desegregate its schools. But I see, personally, in my opinion, I see a lot of difference between the federal government being involved in state education in defense of other constitutionally protected rights, like equal protection under the laws, the 14th Amendment claim, than I do the federal government having any business to tell states what tests its students should take. One of those feels like a big deal to me. The other one feels like the federal government should not be involved. Reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, is presently pending in Congress. It appears that when that law finally is reauthorized, Race to the Top will not be a part of it. It appears at this time that that's going to get cut from the program. In addition to Common Core, we also have other curriculum programs or standards being advanced in science and social studies, for example. The next generation science studies, science standards, have been attacked because they have referred students to issues related to climate change and, of course, the old standby evolution which creates a lot of controversy anytime that comes up. Also, we have seen some cases where states like Texas have tried to redefine history standards in unusual kinds of ways. For example, there was an iteration of Texas standards a couple of years ago where they took out Thomas Jefferson, took him out of U.S. history as relates to education in particular, and replaced him with John Calvin. I'm not really sure how you do that, but that's what they decided to do in Texas. And it has to be noted that Common Core has been attacked both on rational grounds and on irrational grounds. And if one pays attention to the right news sources, you can hear Common Core being associated with communists, witches, homosexuals. There are people out there that claim Common Core state standards are advancing some kind of subversive pedagogy for our children, which I personally find to be balderdash, just not the case at all. But that's politics. That's kind of the way that goes. Well, in the end, what we have found in Kentucky is that the economic divide between schools seems to be increasing. And I just put a couple notes in here to close on. When CARA came out in 1990, its big success was that it equalized school funding. And the way it did that was that it provided more state funds for schools that were poor than it did for schools that were rich. And there was a fairly level playing field for a while. But lately, we've seen that divide grow. And here you see some data on that. By the time we got to 96, 97, 98, the difference between what a rich district was paying per student for its education was about $580 more than what a poor school district would be able to provide. And we've seen now where that has grown to over $1,200. So we're starting to see the same kind of inequities that we saw in the very late 80s. In the 80s, I think 1984 or so, a Whitley County student was receiving 8 times less money for their education than a Fayette County student would receive. So clearly the state has an interest in providing an adequate education to all of its students, but yet we see inequalities creeping back into the system. Well, this has been sort of an update on school reform in Kentucky, particular focus on Common Core. Common Core curriculum standards you are going to have to be very close to as a teacher. You're going to need to know them. You're going to need to know what your resources are. You're going to need to know how to teach them. And that will be the focus of many of your courses going forward. But today we just wanted to give a little look to what's happening with curriculum in Kentucky because that's our topic this week, and so we'll follow up with some activity to try to reinforce this.